Well, hello and welcome to The Zone. I'm your host, Big Wave Dave.
Nobody calls you that. You can't give yourself a nickname.
So today we're going to talk about part 3 of our series on refuting evolution, the fossil record.
Let's recap. In part 1, Bisbee demonstrated that he doesn't even understand the basics of evolution. He didn't know how any of the mechanisms work, he got all of that wrong, and he didn't know what any of the terms mean either. He didn't know that Darwinian evolution is just the Darwinian mechanisms of natural and sexual selection as contrasted with Lamarckian evolution by acquired characteristics, which was still a popular contender in the 19th and 20th centuries. Bisbee thinks that Darwinian evolution refers to a conflation of macroevolution and abiogenesis. He confused the scientific explanation with how life diversifies with collective hypotheses on how life began. He thought that adaptation was somehow not part of evolution, but he thought that abiogenesis was. He was very confused, and he offered no citations other than quoting other creationists pretending to be authorities on evolution. I posted my video with corrections of all of his errors, and I shared it on the Genesis Apologetics Facebook timeline. I don't know how else to reach them publicly, as they evidently don't check their Twitter account. All their Facebook did was remove the tag to my video within a matter of minutes so that none of their readers would see it. Because from what I've seen of their network, they live in an echo chamber where all they ever hear is the reaffirmation of their favorite fantasy, and they've insulated themselves against ever hearing any contraposition. No facts or logic that would dispel the illusion they're trying to preserve. So of course, when Bisbee posted his part 2, he didn't correct anything he'd gotten wrong in part 1, because creationists don't care about truth or factual accuracy, and they will not admit or correct their mistakes. They just keep repeating them like a mantra, which is what he did to continue to make believe. And this time he cited a number of studies, but he got all of them completely wrong. And he used the fallacy of false equivalence to pretend as if science is just another belief system, like his own biased and baseless assumptions of magical mysticism. It's funny that he's trying so hard to refute evolution by grossly and deliberately, dishonestly and deceptively distorting scientific position, all while pretending that he has the moral and intellectual high ground. So let's see how much Bisbee got wrong in this, his third attempt, failing to refute evolution.
So what is the fossil record? Well, the fossil record is billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the world.
Did you know there are billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth?
I expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth.
Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth.
More accurately, the fossil record is the history of life as documented by fossils in the Geologic column, which can be read as a book of biological history revealed in geology. And importantly, fossils are not always laid down by water. We also find fossils in tar pits and buried under blankets of volcanic ash, like the 12-million-year-old ashfall fossil beds in Nebraska, or the 160-million-year-old fossils in Liaoning province of China, which are both obviously inconsistent with the idea of a global flood that would have washed the ash off of everything, even at the tops of mountains. Understand also that there are several methods of radiometric dating, and that it is a demonstrably reliable method whose ages are absolute.
So today's question is this: does the fossil record prove Darwinian evolution?
Have you noticed how believers reject evidence outright? All of it. Refusing to accept anything because nothing could ever be conclusive enough to be beyond unreasonable doubt. As if they need absolute proof of evolution before they will even begin to reconsider their own indefensible assumptions that they're absolutely convinced of for no good reason at all. A science is completely opposite of that. A science has a rule that you can never prove anything in the positive sense. So even though atomic theory, the theory of gravity, and the germ theory of disease have, like evolution, all been proven in the colloquial sense of having an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt, we still can't say that any of them have been proven scientifically, because the scientific position is that it is only possible to prove mathematic concepts mathematically. Otherwise, proof doesn't exist in science. So instead, what we say is that evolution, not just Darwinian evolution, but all evolution, is supported by the fossil record and by molecular phylogeny and embryology and so on, where there is nothing nowhere that either contradicts evolution or that supports the biblical fable of creation instead.
Let's start with this. The fossils and the layers of the earth are laid down in what scientists called a geologic column. Now, there are different opinions about this column. For example, evolutionists believe that this column represents billions of years of evolution of animals evolving from very simple creatures to very complex.
It's not a belief. What believers mean by that is whatever they've chosen to make believe in lieu of evidence or even in spite of evidence to the contrary, and they're determined to keep believing that no matter what, because their position is not based on reason. That's what faith is all about. But we can only respect what the evidence indicates, wherein each of the various layers of the geologic column are known to reveal certain species that are always only ever found in those layers and nowhere else. And regardless where those layers are found, anywhere in the world, they are always radiometrically dated to within the same age, so that Permian strata in South Africa or in Russia or in Texas is always the same age, being between 299 to 252 million years or so ago, and that contain only species known to exist in those layers. There are no dinosaurs in the Paleozoic or the Cenozoic, except for birds, of course. There are no trilobites or eurypterids in the Mesozoic or Cenozoic, and none of the mammals we have today existed in either of those earlier eras. And of course, the closer you zoom in, the more precise the details resolve to be. And notice that Bisbee implies that the scientific position is man's word, as if the man-made mythology that he believes in is God's word. No. We're looking at and referring to the record written in the rocks. People can write books. That's easy. Lots of different religions have done exactly that for all the gods ever imagined by men. But we can't fake the geologic column. That is beyond our ability. So if there was a God, then that would be God's word, not man's word. We didn't write it. God would have, right? What they call God's word are actually the tall tales made up by mere fallible human storytellers. The geologic column was discovered and described by Christians, hoping to validate their global flood myth. Not to reaffirm their faith, because faith doesn't need or want evidence and wouldn't bow to it anyway. Rather, they did it because they wanted to understand what is really true. But regardless where they looked all over the world, they found no evidence of a flood. Instead, they found substantial evidence against the flood, and they found the geologic column indicated everywhere.
Now, as a biblical creationist, I believe that the vast majority of fossils were created by the global flood that's described in the book of Genesis.
Well, there's an informed opinion.
So which viewpoint does the evidence support? Now, according to Darwin, if his theory is true, what we ought to find is lots of fossils of intermediate animals.
And we did find and keep finding numerous examples of exactly that, with a list of more than 1,000 transitional intermediates discovered so far, even by the strictest definition of that word, closing the gaps in just about every lineage you can think of, so that there are hardly any links missing anymore. But evolution isn't just Darwin's theory any more than gravity is just Newton's theory. The science has continued well beyond Darwin, or Newton for that matter, with revelations in the extended evolutionary synthesis and in relativity theory far beyond anything Darwin or Newton could have understood or even guessed at.
In other words, animals changing from one kind to another.
Except that there's no such thing as a kind. And there was never any time in evolutionary history where one kind of animal was ever supposed to change into a different kind of animal. We have quite a fluid sequence of transition from basal archosaurs developing through dinosaurs and into birds. But birds are not a different kind. They're still dinosaurs. They're still archosaurs, too. It's the same thing for the transition from terrestrial seti-artiodactylids to fully marine whales, and from land-lubbing ceridians to manatees. We have every link necessary in either lineage, and they both still belong to every parent category as all their ancestors did. The same thing applies to the transition from what we used to think of as reptiles to mammals. We have every intermediate link necessary, with every incremental developmental stage now represented by a transitional species found in the fossil record. That did force us to reevaluate what the word reptile means. The word used to be a character-based description of cold-blooded tetrapods with claws and scales and legs sprawling out to the sides. But eventually people noticed that that description excludes things like snakes and dinosaurs and ichthyosaurs and so on, things that maybe didn't match any of that description, even if they were universally accepted as reptiles. So now we base our taxonomy on phylogeny, where the ancestors of mammals were synapsid tetrapods and the ancestors of reptiles were diapsid tetrapods, and the descendants of both groups are still the same kind as all their ancient ancestors were.
Things like this? Is that what we find?
No, because those are all laughable blends of current species, completely ignoring all fossil forms. Just look at these. They're not very imaginative. They're all bipeds, not a quadruped to be found in the group. 2 of them are eutherian mammal heads mounted onto metatherian bodies, and 2 more are just different forms of the same species, with the head of domestic dogs mounted onto the bodies of passerine birds, having no relevance to nor connection with any aspect of evolution. The closest connection is the dinosaur fish with the head of a teleos sprouting out of the body of a sarcopterygian. This illustration ignores another functionally complete and fluid transition from common ancestral chordates into all modern fish as well as all terrestrial tetrapods. We are still sarcopterygian, and we're still chordates too. We never changed into a different kind.
Now, I don't know about you, but that guy is really disturbing.
I don't know about you, but that guy is really disturbing. He clearly hasn't got the slightest idea what he's talking about ever, but he thinks he knows more than the entire global scientific community. And he's lying to children for the express purpose of diminishing their critical thinking, of stunting their intellectual development to make them more susceptible to the deceitful propaganda of religious indoctrination. I would call that evil. It's certainly child abuse.
Can you imagine him flying around and chomping on people's ears? That would be very scary. But is that what we find?
Of course not. To clarify, the reptile family tree has a deep fork between 2 main branches. On the one side are lepidosaurs, that's lizards and snakes, ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and a bunch more fascinating fossil forms that you've never heard of. And on the other side are archosaurs, reptiles with hard-shelled eggs. And this group splits again, with one fork leading to crocodilomorphs on the one side and the more advanced avemetatarsallians on the other. These are your pterosaurs and dinosaurs, including birds. So ducks come from the dinosaur lineage, while crocodiles come from this other one. And their common ancestor, then, was a basal archosaur like Euparkeria that doesn't look anything like a crocoduck. As I explained in my video on the 9th foundational falsehood of creationism,
there are 3 different types of transitional forms, and we have ample examples of each. But creationists still insist that we've never found a single one, because what they usually ask us to present are impossible parodies which evolution would neither produce nor permit.
You've got to be able to prove transitional forms, one animal transitioning into another. And all through the fossil record and life, we don't find one of these. A crocoduck. There's just nothing like it.
In fact, Darwin explained in detail why we should not find anything like this. We're not looking for any blend of 2 species that both currently exist. Such a thing would actually go against evolution. Instead, he said that if his theory were true, that what we should find would be a basal form potentially ancestral to both current species. And in this one case alone, we found dozens of them in a near continuous lineage dating back to the dawn of the Mesozoic era.
and as I explained in the 11th foundational falsehood of creationism,
in the evolutionary perspective, any single ancestral species can diverge into 2 or more daughter species, each becoming so distinct that eventually either of the new species would be unable to interbreed with the ancestral and/or sister species anymore. But by ignoring fossil forms, the creationist perspective has that completely backwards, insisting instead on an illusory sequence of separately conjured kinds, which, like information, must remain forever undefined, and they imagine that evolutionary diversity can only occur by mixing these kinds in hybridization. This is another reason they reject transitional fossils and instead demand some blend only between current kinds. Their perspective has no depth.
Both of those videos were posted 14 years ago. And Bisbee is still repeating errors today that were corrected long before then, and which he should have been embarrassed about then. Yet he is still shameless and oblivious even now.
Let's talk about the real fossil record. So the first thing is that creatures have always been complex. This is the fossil of a trilobite, and he's found in some of the lowest layers in the geologic column. Now, according to evolutionists, at that level, the creatures that we find there should be very, very simple.
Except that no evolutionist ever said that. Unicellular organisms are more simple than multicellular organisms, and many scientists have talked about that. But Bisbee hasn't read any of the papers he thinks he's referring to. Like John and Jane from another side branch of this series, Bisbee too is merely reading from a script or a list of talking points parroted from other apologists. And like a parrot, he often doesn't know what the words he says even mean.
But you know what? This guy is anything but simple. So he has eyes, and each eye has over 3,000 lenses to help this guy see underwater. Does that sound simple to you?
Well, it doesn't have any more brain power than any other arthropod, does it? No more than it needs to survive. Does that sound like a divine design to you?
I don't think so. And this is just one example.
And it's a fine example of evolution, since we have candidates for Precambrian precursors radiating into some 20,000 species of trilobites. And different varieties only occur in certain portions of the geologic column, which contradicts the idea of a magical creator conjuring every life form at once, because the fossil record shows this illustration of life changing over time.
Well, there are so many others that show complexity from the very beginning.
Bisbee thinks that complexity implies design. He's a simple man befuddled by complicated things. He doesn't understand that a hallmark of intelligent design would be inefficient simplicity, rather than the excessive complexity seen in biology that is so inefficient and wasteful. But it is an inevitable product of emergent patterns from the molecular scale on up, as opposed to his imagined authority commanding orchestration from the top down. In other words, this level of unnecessary complexity is indicative of blind design resulting from a haphazard incidental configuration.
Second thing to think about is that creatures are basically the same. We don't see animals changing from one type to another.
Yes, we definitely do. For every age of paleohistory, we find a type of bivalves or diatoms or foraminifera or what have you that only existed within that range. For example, we can find ammonites in the Paleozoic through the Mesozoic, but they're not all the same. The earliest ones had straight conical shells, and they became increasingly curved over millions of years until the most recent ones are completely curled. And there are other indicators in their shells as well, such that scientists could tell just by looking at them what level of strata they likely came from. And their evolution definitely looks more like a matter of random mutations in population genetics, certainly not an intelligent design with intended purpose. Whoever made these didn't know what he was doing or what he was shooting for. And as this site explains, the ammonoid subclass can be divided into a half dozen different orders that all appear in different times in paleohistory. So we can see that these are not basically the same throughout time. They do change.
Have you ever heard of living fossils? Now, these are fossils that are supposed to be millions of years old, but look a lot like what we have living today.
Come on, Bisbee, can't you get anything right? Living fossils are not fossils at all. They're living organisms that are representative or illustrative of earlier, usually closely related forms, like the two species of coelacanth we have today that are in the same order as, but still not the same species or even the same family as these coelacanths known from the fossil record, from different periods of geologic history. Because it turns out the fossil record shows organisms changing over time.
Here's some examples. What is that? Well, that, of course, is a lobster. Now, it's supposed to be 200 million years old, but it looks just like lobsters today.
You can't trust anything a creationist says. The earliest fossil lobster I know of is only half that old, and it's more primitive than this one. And lobsters are not a species. They're not a genus either. They're a taxonomic family that includes dozens of these clawed-type species today. Evolution is all about biodiversity. That means that different varieties have evolved over time. They can range from little mud bugs like this one up the creek to much bigger marine monsters like this. And of course, there are other variants as well. And none of them are the same species as those from 100 million years ago.
And that, if you said dragonfly, you're right. So question, if this thing is 300 million years old, why hasn't it evolved into something different? Why does this look just like dragonflies today?
Because it doesn't look like dragonflies today, and it did evolve into something else. The giant Meganeura from 247 million years ago is a predatory insect that was in its day the largest flying animal before bats or birds or even pterosaurs. It resembled a dragonfly, but was only distantly related to them. Instead, it was a more primitive version of griffin flies that only lasted from the late Carboniferous through Permian. After that, you had the precursors of damselflies and such, until true dragonflies finally evolved in the Jurassic. And they have since diversified into some 3,000 species, just among the ones alive today, to say nothing of all those other species that lived at various points in the past. But why should I expect Bisbee to know anything about evolution if he thinks that it should call for a crocoduck?
This is a cockroach. Black. I don't know about you, but I really don't like these guys. So let's move on.
Give him credit, though. Cockroaches have evolved into 4,600 some odd species today, to say nothing of all the fossil species tracing back over the ages. They're not 250 million years old like the picture says. The earliest roach fossils are only about 100 million years old. And roaches and their descendants are, I think, the only insects with a true neck. But what's really interesting is, if you want to see something that evolved into something else, then just imagine one important mutation that significantly changed what the cockroach is. A flexible hinge between the thorax and the abdomen, the ability to arc upward, such that the front legs aren't needed for walking anymore. All the weight is in the rear anyway, so it walks on the forelegs in the back, leaving the front two to become arms, modified for grasping. That's right, cockroaches are closely related to the mantis, and after that one change happened way back then, to create a new branch in the Dictyoptera lineage, mantids went on to further refine themselves, evolving into some 2,400 species today.
Okay. 200 million year old crocodile, and it looks just like crocodiles today. Are you starting to see a pattern here?
Yeah, fossilized birds look like birds, and fossilized shrimp look like shrimp. Not the same species as today in either case, but nonetheless, fossilized birds do not look like shrimp, and Bisbee thinks this means something. In the case of crocodilians, there are a number of interesting details. The 27 species of crocodilians we have today descend from the only large animal to survive the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, because their metabolism is so slow that they can go a month without eating. It's important to note that there were many different species of crocodilians in the Mesozoic era that were obviously very different than today's crocodiles, alligators, gharials, and caimans. And not just because those dinosaur killers were so much bigger, they were each uniquely distinct beyond that. And while the crocodilians did emerge about 200 million years ago in the early Jurassic, they came from a diverse group of Triassic crocodilomorphs called pseudoscience that included high-speed terrestrial hunters, some that were apparently arboreal, at least one of them had hooves, and a few others had become armor-plated herbivores, herbivorous crocodilians. And some of them were bipedal, looking like a kind of a prototype for dinosaurs, except that these were more like the old-fashioned notion of dinosaurs, the way we used to think of dinosaurs back in the black and white movies from a century ago. All those old crocodilomorphs died out, where only the crocodilians persisted. And crocodilians had the perfect shape, too, occupying a niche that had previously been held by other things that Bisbee would say look just like crocodiles today, except that they're not crocodiles at all. Before crocodilians, there were phytosaurs, very similar but definitely a different lineage. Same effect, though, especially since some of them got up to 40 feet long. And they died out at the end of the Triassic, just as crocodilians clocked in for the Jurassic shift. And prior to that, before the Triassic, in the Permian period, it was a very different world, where swamps and marshes hid ambush predators like this. Now, doesn't that look just like a crocodile? Except that it's not. It's not even a reptile. The Permian was a time when the part of a crocodile could be played by a 30-foot-long salamander called Prionosuchus, and the frog-mouthed Mastodontosaurus could snap the breath out of you and swallow you whole. Imagine being eaten alive by a giant newt. And my point is that animals are not basically the same over time, because the fossil record really does show changes in different ages.
Fossilized bats look like, guess what? Bats.
And bats are a taxonomic order with a genetic hierarchy of diversification into some 1,400 species alive today, which are not the same species as the additional ones that we find in the fossil record.
This isn't hard. In fact, there are no ancestors to bats found in the fossil record. There are no pre-bats.
It is true that the transition from basal shrew-like insectivorans to an intermediate form with bats is one of, I think, only 5 lineages that have predicted links but haven't already been discovered. because they're usually tiny and they're often in environments where fossilization is unlikely. That and the transitional form, which would have a gliding membrane very similar to that of a flying squirrel or a colugo, might not be evident in the skeleton. But seeing how they've identified a very similar form in Volaticotherium, an egg-laying triconodont mammal from the Jurassic period, and knowing how many other transitional intermediates have been discovered just in the last 20 years or so, I'm sure we'll find one soon enough. Triconodonts were a whole other order of mammals now entirely extinct that people have never heard of. And creationists used to say that there were no precursors for this or that lineage, but then we kept finding them. So when Bisbee points out that such is still missing in bats, is that an implicit admission that he knows we've already found those links in other lineages?
What we see is that they appear in the fossil record fully formed just like God made them.
Except that, one, they weren't created by magic, and two, they didn't appear fully formed. The earliest bat in the fossil record is more primitive than the much more derived bats of today. One of the features, for example, is streamlining in the wing. The original one had 5 fingers, and modern bats all have streamlined down to 4.
The fossil record shows stasis.
No, it doesn't. It shows near constant change.
We don't see animals changing from one kind to another.
Because evolution doesn't teach or require any such thing, and there's no such thing as a kind.
Scientists have discovered living fossils for virtually every type of living thing
that are different species than we have today, having always evolved into new varieties, and that should not be expected to turn into something else, a different kind, the way creationists imagine.
So I have a question for you. According to Lawrence Berkeley, this guy is your great-great-great-grandpa. In over 60 to 70 million years, he evolved into whales and bats and people. So here's my question. If that is true, then why do we see animals that are supposed to be hundreds of million years old and they didn't show any change? Well, you see the problem? Yeah, it's a big problem for evolution.
No, it's only a problem for people who don't know what they're talking about, who think that taxonomic families are the same thing as species, and who don't understand that we do see plenty of evolutionary change, even in those forms that Bisbee mistakenly calls living fossils. If you'd like to see proof of that with respect to the lineage that Bisbee was just talking about, check out my series on the systematic classification of life, starting at episode 21, going on to 22. I'll put a link below.
Okay, let's move on to number 3. Most fossils were created by the global flood.
No way. It's false. It never happened. It's a made-up tale.
Do we have any evidence for that?
No, not this time.
We do.
No way. You're wrong.
Lots of it.
Not a chance. It never happened. It's fiction. It's a total fabrication.
Let's take a closer look. Usually when you find fossils, they're in these massive graveyards. We have all these animals that were busted up and then washed together. Like this pile in Utah. We have over 2,000 bones with 11 different kinds of dinosaurs in a jumbled mess, together with crocodiles, turtles, lizards, frogs, and clams. Now that's interesting. We have land animals mixed in with animals that live in the ocean.
That's not unusual for a tsunami. For example, the Chicxulub planetoid left a 100-mile-wide crater in the Yucatan Peninsula and produced a mile-high tsunami. And scientists have recently discovered fossilized mega-ripples from this tsunami buried under 1,500 meters of sediment in Louisiana, and that are concentric back to the impact crater. Evidence indicating this super tsunami, including a mass grave site dated to the time of the impact, has been found as far away as North Dakota. But that doesn't explain this site, which was evidently a different tsunami, 83 million years earlier, because, as I explained in the 6th video of this playlist, this site dates to 149 million years ago, when there was a river system that fed into the Sundance Sea that until that time covered most of Utah. California was just connecting to the North American continental plate, so even though Utah is landlocked now, it used to have a shoreline. Every species in this jumble is Jurassic, from the middle period of the Mesozoic era. Even the crocodiles and turtles and such are Mesozoic. There is nothing here from the Paleozoic era before that or from the Cenozoic era afterward. Each of the 11 dinosaur species found in the site, Stegosaurus, Apatosaurus, Allosaurus, Diplodocus, and so on, are famously, exclusively Jurassic. If this event had happened 60 million years earlier, there would be Triassic species instead, or 60 million years later, and they would all be Cretaceous species, because the fossil record shows change over time. Now, if the world was only 6,000 years old and this event had occurred during the mythical global flood of Noah's Ark, then there should be things in here mixed in from all different time periods together. But we've never seen that sort of jumble anywhere ever.
In fact, if you go throughout North America to these different massive graveyards, you'll see a lot of signs that say that the animals were buried by floods.
Because at least a couple of those areas are the sites of the Missoula and Bonneville megafloods, a series of recurring supermassive floods roughly 17,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, when huge freshwater lakes were held back by ice dams until those dams broke, flash flooding a whole state under a tsunami traveling across dry land. If you'd like to see more details about that fascinating event, check out the 12th video in this playlist, Debunking John and Jane 3 of 12. I'll put a link below.
In that, a lot of times you'll find land animals buried with shark teeth and fish and clams and other marine creatures. What could do that? What could wash land animals and sea creatures together? I think you know.
I do know. Better than you. If we look at the same map, we have the supermassive megafloods I mentioned a moment ago that are not known for their fossils but for scouring the landscape around 17,000 years ago. But if you go way back to the Cretaceous period, you'll see that North America was once divided by the Western Interior Seaway. I've stood on the shores of that ancient beach. And this, of course, would have been devastated by the Chicxulub tsunami, as well as by occasional conventional tsunamis and storm surge situations and so on.
Now, when we do find intact skeletons in the fossil record, they often look like they drowned. These poor little guys were drowned in mud.
Maybe sometimes, but not necessarily, and certainly not always. Because, as I explained earlier in the series, experiments with dead chickens, which have the same bones in their neck, because they are dinosaurs, show that it's difficult for any pressure to push the head down when the animal is decomposing. But any pressure the other way will easily cause this opistotonic contortion, and that can happen no matter how a dinosaur dies or what environment the dinosaur dies in.
We even have fish buried with dinosaurs.
Which can happen a bunch of different ways, but not by a global flood. That can't happen. And we know for certain and can prove that it didn't happen.
Speaking of fish, check this out. This fish was eating when he was buried. And so was this one. And this one too. Whatever happened to these fish happened suddenly. They died a very quick, violent death.
No, they didn't. Fish often try to eat things bigger than they can swallow, things that obstruct their gill flow long enough that since the fish cannot disgorge its meal, it dies from a lack of oxygen. Dead fish float to the surface and often wash onto the beach if they're close enough, where they are quickly buried, either by the surf or by the collapse of an eroding hillside or what have you, and that's how we get so many fossils of fish who died slowly of their own stupidity. What would not happen is that a global flood would not flash fossilize a fish. Don't be so stupid.
You are really dumb, for real.
Did you know that scientists often find seashells on mountains? Even on Mount Everest. Now, time out. Mount Everest is over 29,000 feet high. How did we get marine fossils on there? Well, here's one idea.
Floodwaters have really risen high enough to cover all 29,000 plus feet of Mount Everest? Well, secular and creation scientists agree that the floodwaters didn't rise high enough to cover the mountains. The mountains were smaller and more level, and were uplifted by the collision of continental plates to the heights that they are now. Sedimentary layers containing marine creatures were also uplifted to the higher elevations. That's how come we can find fossils of sea creatures atop the mountains of the Himalayas.
He's right. Except that secular scientists and many Christian scientists too agree that the global flood never happened, nor could it have. Secular scientists and even other young Earth creationists agree that Walt Brown's hydroplate theory has questionable initial conditions, a lack of in-depth analysis, arbitrary fitting of data to his model, questionable references and analogies, dubious significance in the predictions, and problematic comparison tables. There really is no such thing as a creation scientist because there is no science that supports creation. But there is a science of tectonics, And that shows that when the Indian subcontinent collided with the Eurasian supercontinent, the seafloor between these bodies was thrust skyward to become the Himalayas, which are still rising by over a centimeter every year.
You know, it's very interesting. In Psalm 104, it talks about that the waters were standing above the mountains, and that the mountains rose and then the valleys sank down. That sure sounds like a description of the flood to me.
It's not. Psalm 104 was a reference to the fable of creation, wherein God created a glass bubble in the midst of an eternal abyss where everything was supposed to be underwater. And then God raised the land up by draining some of the water out of the firmament that we know never existed. Then he created the sun, much smaller than the earth, and put it inside that glass bubble. And that's one of many ways that we know that the Genesis creation myth is just a fable, with not even a kernel of truth to it.
Finally, in the fossil record, we find soft tissues in fossils that are supposed to be millions of years old. Things like blood cells and blood vessels and nerves and collagen. Well, if they're that old, why do we still find soft tissues in them?
Because, apart from collagen, which turns out to be surprisingly robust, those are only the semi-lithified remains of those structures. They're usually microscopic and only occur deep inside large, well-insulated bones, and they only become soft after spending weeks in an acid bath to delithify them, to effectively unfossilize them. So they are not the way young Earth creationists make them out to be.
And this is no secret. This has been talked about and written about in many of the mainstream scientific journals.
And Mary Schweitzer, the scientist who became famous for discovering these, was a young Earth creationist when she started work in the fossil labs, but she's not a creationist anymore, now that she has seen proof of both evolution and deep time. But she is still a Christian, and she is quite irritated with the way young Earth creationists habitually misrepresent her work, because these religious extremists make mainstream Christians look dishonest. And that's irritating when you're an honest Christian and everyone thinks that's an oxymoron because of Bisbee and other oxymorons like him.
So we have millions of sea creatures mixed in with millions of land animals. What could do that? The global flood, just like the Bible teaches.
Or, since we've never seen millions of sea creatures mixed in with millions of land animals in all of our collective fossil digs, the more likely explanation is that a few professional tellers of tall tales are exaggerating and embellishing in an attempt to defend an already disproven fantasy.
Okay then, if the flood created this, then what caused this pattern or this sequence?
Here we go.
Well, first of all, the flood was not this, gentle 40 days and 40 nights of rain that were often taught in nursery school. It was a total catastrophe that lasted over 370 days. Now, the Bible tells us in Genesis 7:11 that on the day the flood started, the fountains of the deep burst forth. Now, scientists believe that that's a reference to the crust of the earth splitting. We had all kinds of earthquakes and land movement, and that would produce tsunamis, which some people call them tidal waves, but they're actually called tsunamis. So what would happen is for 150 days, the water kept rising, and tsunami after tsunami would crash upon the continents. And as they went, they would bury creatures in their path. You see, the creatures were buried according to where they lived, not when they lived.
This could very well be the stupidest person on the face of the earth.
That was an impressively stupid thing to say, even for Bisbee. He's saying that giant ground sloths managed to outrun velociraptors, that somehow ichthyosaurs all died before mosasaurs, which all died before four-legged whales or manatees, apparently because those waddling whales and manatees were able to climb to higher ground than even pterosaurs could get to. Apparently, giant rhinos can climb higher than that too. Bisbee and other creationists like him are proving what Einstein said about how human stupidity is infinite.
By the way, what about people? We don't see too many people in the fossil record. Why is that? Well, people are smart.
That's why there's ivermectin, the COVID-19 treatment option for real patriots.
Why is everyone so fucking stupid?
And if you see the water coming, what would you do? Well, I would run to higher ground or maybe jump aboard a boat.
How well do you think that worked out for the 250,000 people who were killed in the 2004 tsunami? Especially considering that a third of all humanity live on a coastline and always have.
But here's the problem. Since the flood lasted 370 days, if you didn't have enough food and water or a really sturdy boat, you weren't going to make it.
Remember that the purpose of this flood, that we know never really happened, was because an omniscient, infallible God who can see the future somehow didn't see the future and ended up regretting that he had created humans. And rather than correct a tiny population of people living in the Levant, God decided he needed to wipe them off the face of the earth. And he couldn't just blink them out of existence either. So instead of wishing them into the cornfield like some more efficient gods could have done, this God decided that every baby deer in South America and every koala in Australia needed to drown just to get rid of a few people that were, according to the story, still living all in one place. So it's not just the believers being stupid. Their God is stupid too.
So during the second part of the flood, the water started draining back down.
It's always funny when a geologist asks a creationist where all that water went, because they both already know that it's a bullshit story and that the other person already knows that it is.
So as the water came off of the continents and went back into the ocean basins, it carved out through erosion a lot of the features that we see today, some of the valleys. Now eventually the grass and the plants grew back, but underneath them were these layers that were laid down by the flood, containing the remains of billions of different types of creatures that we call the fossil record.
No, that is not remotely possible, and it cannot account for practically anything we see in geology. I can think of dozens of geologic structures that directly contradict this. Just the work of James Hutton alone, back in the 18th century, already disproves this. I made an 8-part series showing how geology disproves the flood, and how meteorology, paleontology, dendrochronology, zoology, archaeology, anthropology, and even mythology disprove the global flood myth. But the geology video could have been a whole series by itself. And when I took a college course in historical geology, I had 2 teachers who both said on the first day that if you believe in the global flood today, you won't by next week. It was a secular school, but both of those teachers were Christian. And even Christian schools will not teach flood geology because they know that it's not real science. It's the blatantly dishonest, utter nonsense of infinite stupidity.
Okay, so the characteristics of the fossil record, creatures have always been complex.
As they would due to emergent patterns from the molecular scale.
Creatures are basically the same. They did not evolve from one kind to another.
They're not the same. They did evolve, they still evolve, and there's no such thing as a kind.
And finally, most of the fossils were created during the global flood described in the book of Genesis.
No fossils were ever produced in a flood that never happened.
Does the fossil record prove Darwinian evolution? No, it doesn't.
Yes, it definitely does.
So during our series, we have looked at different meanings for the word evolution. We've discovered that natural selection and adaptation and genetic variation are a fact. But this idea here, that all creatures evolve from a single-celled life form over millions of years, really a philosophy that requires a lot of faith. It is not based upon good science.
Without bothering to list all of the good science that the macroevolutionary concept is actually based on throughout paleontology, embryology, genetics, and so on, let me just remind you that the National Academy of Science, the National Center for Biotechnology Information, and numerous other academic institutions and textbooks agree that evolution is the foundation of modern biology, and the only people who pretend otherwise are a lunatic fringe of willfully ignorant religious extremists like this uneducated idiot whose career pinnacle was apparently an unskilled position with an electric utility company. He wouldn't know what good science is if it bit him, and it's going to.
What we see is what God said, that he created everything according to its kind.
Except that even Christian scientists agree that no, he didn't, and that is not what we see. Instead, we actually see that life really does evolve, and that it always has evolved, and that there is no such thing as a kind.
And he gave the creatures the ability to adapt to their environment, which is why we see such a variety around us today.
Yes, animals have the ability to evolve, not because they were created that way, but because of new genetic information provided by mutations. This is an established fact that Bisbee and other creationists refuse to admit, no matter how well documented it is.
Why does any of this matter? Well, here's the reason. According to this textbook, if evolution is true, you're an earthworm. Well, that's not very nice. Well, okay, no, you're not a worm. You're a fish. How does that feel? Somebody calling you a fish, right?
But, boy, this is awkward. Your buddy Ben says, facts don't care about your feelings.
And, as Darwin said, there is a grandeur to this view of life, especially from a Buddhist or Taoist perspective, because we truly are one with everything. We are a part of this world, not apart from it, despite what some Christians try to pretend. Because, as even the Bible says, humans are animals, and as Bisbee here just demonstrated himself, it is only our vanity that prevents some people from admitting this fact.
Don't you believe this for a second?
Know it for the rest of your life, because we can prove it, and you should learn how, just so you can be sure.
The Bible tells us, and science confirms, that we were made in the image of God. You are special. Please don't ever forget that.
Science confirms that, does it? I'm going to need a citation. Point to the peer-reviewed research that backs that up, because I've seen polls that most scientists, the majority of them, are atheist, that twice as many scientists don't believe in God as the few who do, and that most of the scientists who do believe in God accept evolution, too, that less than 1% of biologists or geologists give any credence to creationism. And I'm pretty sure that the leaders of the world's collective religions agree that belief in God is still a matter of faith, because it is not supported by any science at all. I mean, I don't want to call Bisbee a liar, but that's what he is.